So we're in Boston, right? City of Beans? And of course, the birthplace of the Mafia in America. In fact, it was the place where the Italian-American Mafia really started to take shape with gangs from both Naples and Sicily making their way here through Ellis Island. This all happened during the late 19th century and early 20th century. This is also when the 5 families of the Mafia got started: Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese. Now today, though, the Italian-American Mafia has sort of taken a back seat to other crime groups. But back in the day, they were the most feared criminals around. And believe it or not, there are still members of these families, but they prefer to stay out of the spotlight. However, if you want to know what they were like at their peak, then listen up, because I'm about to tell you the story of one dinner, 2 duns, and no survivors. It all began in 1931 with the meeting of 2 men, Salvatore Maranzano and Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Now, these 2 men were both bosses of the Mafia, but they didn't like each other very much. And in fact, they had been feuding for quite some time already. See, Lucky Luciano was born in Italy, but moved to America as a young man. And by the time he was in his 20s, he was already a made man in the Mafia. He worked under a guy named Max Bobo-Hoff, who was the boss of a crime family that operated out of New York. And while working under Hoff, Lucky proved himself to be a worthy soldier in the organization, eventually becoming caporegime, which is the second in command. However, once Max was sentenced to prison for 50 years, Lucky took over the family and changed its name to Luciano. And this was about the same time that he met Sal Maranzano. Now, Sal was a little older than Lucky. He was born in 1879 in Sicily and immigrated to the U.S. in the early 1900s. He also quickly rose through the ranks of the Mafia, became boss of the rival crime family called Murder Inc., now Lucky Luciano's father. Giovanni actually worked under Sal Maranzano for a time, and Lucky would later say that his father respected Sal as a superior. So even though Lucky and Sal were rivals, Lucky still held Sal in high regard. But as the years went on, the relationship between them turned sour. In fact, there were rumors that Lucky Luciano had tried to kill Maranzano several times, and Maranzano knew it. So when the two saw each other, things would get pretty tense. In 1931, though, tension turned to violence. On September 14th, a car pulled up outside of Maranzano's house. A man got out, walked up to the door, and knocked. When someone answered, he asked for Don Sal, and when he was let in, he sat down and waited. Not long after, Sal came into the room and introduced himself. And as soon as the two shook hands, the hitman shot Sal 3 times in the chest and once in the head. He then calmly stood up, strolled out of the house, and disappeared into the night. And that was that. For over a year, the Mafia was thrown into chaos as the 5 families scrambled to figure out who was behind the hit. Is it the Irish mob? Maybe it was the Jewish mob. Maybe it was even Al Capone. After all, the two were rivals at the time. Or maybe it was Lucky Luciano. But you see, evidence pointed to Lucky. His men had followed Maranzano for days and even weeks before the murder, and they knew his schedule better than anyone. And Lucky had also been trying to eliminate Sal for years. So it wasn't hard to imagine why the other bosses thought that Lucky was behind it. However, Lucky vehemently denied killing Maranzano, and according to him, he had nothing to do with the hit. But then a mysterious letter showed up, and it seemed to prove Lucky's innocence. It said, "Do unlook for me as I am far away, and it will be difficult to find me. Your friend Joe." And if you remember, Lucky's father, Giovanni, worked under Sal Maranzano, and Joe was none other than Joseph Masseria. And if it was him, then it made sense that he would try to protect Lucky. And so the investigation continued until one day a meeting was arranged between Lucky Luciano and the other 4 bosses to discuss the murder. They met at a house in Queens, New York, and during the meeting, Lucky swore that he wasn't involved. And he even offered to give up his own men to be investigated. However, the other bosses weren't buying it, and they felt that Lucky needed to be punished. And so they agreed that Lucky and his brother would have to be eliminated. But instead of just having them whacked, they decided that they would do something much worse. They would send them to the mattresses. You heard that right? They wanted to make an example out of the Luciano brothers by humiliating them in front of the entire Mafia. See? Being sent to the mattresses meant that you were stripped of your title and position in the organization, when we're now nothing more than a civilian. You were also kicked out of your house and left to wander the streets. This was considered the worst punishment that the Mafia could hand down. Lucky, however, refused to go down without a fight. As soon as he got word that a hit had been put out on him, he went into hiding. Then he did something crazy. He surrendered to the police and gave them all the info they'd ever need to take down the other bosses. And that's right, he became a rat. Of course, the Mafia was furious, but there was nothing they could do. Thanks to Lucky's info, every single boss, Underboss and Caporeggium of the 5 families was arrested, along with hundreds of soldiers. This event is now known as the Commission, and it effectively decimated the Italian-American Mafia. Sure, they bounced back eventually, but they never reached the heights that they had before, and all because of one betrayal. As for Lucky, he served only 5 years in prison and was released in 1936. He then went back to running his crime family. But he was never the same again. He was now a wanted man in multiple countries, and he knew that the FBI would be watching his every move. So he spent most of his time in Cuba, and when he came back to America, he was careful not to draw any attention to himself. He even avoided engaging in activities that would attract the attention of the media, and he kept a low profile for the rest of his life. He had successfully switched from being a powerful mob boss to a businessman, and he remained that way until he died of a heart attack in 1962. As for the other bosses, they didn't fare as well. Most of them were given lengthy prison sentences, but they were released after serving only a few years. However, they were all too old to run their families by then, and the younger guys had already taken over. And even though they tried to keep things as they were, things would never be the same again. So there you have it, the story of one dinner, 2 duns, and no survivors. It may not have been the most exciting story ever told, but it sure was an important one. If you liked it, then stay tuned for more stories about the Mafia. See ya.